Wait, what happens when a man loses everything and God stays silent? In this video, you'll witness the raw, unsettling journey of Job. Pain, silence, faith under pressure, and a truth most people are not ready to face. Stay to watch until the end, because what is revealed can change how you see suffering forever. Don't miss this. This is what the Bible teaches. What happens when a righteous man loses everything, but heaven remains silent? What happens when pain does not come as a visitor, but as a dominion, occupying the soul, the house, and the very air one breathes? The story of Job does not begin with tragedy, it begins with integrity. And that is exactly why his pain is so frightening. Because in Job 1 and 2, the Bible does not just present a wounded man. It reveals a mirror for every soul that has ever wondered why suffering insists on entering where faithfulness seemed to protect. It was not a legend. It was not imagination. It was not an exaggeration. It was a man of God being broken from the inside while still needing to remain standing. Think about that for a moment. Job had a name, a home, children, servants, flocks, and honor. Everything around him seemed sustained by a visible, almost sacred order. But the book pulls back the curtain and leads us into a deeper reality. Before the earth shook, heaven was already in motion. Job 1 shows a scene that few can endure with a calm mind. Satan appears among the sons of God, and the suffering of one man becomes the stage for a dispute he never asked to enter. What seemed to be merely human loss carried an invisible battle. And that changes everything, because suddenly, Job's pain ceases to be just grief. It becomes a territory of revelation. And then, something even graver happened. In a single day, the man who seemed surrounded by protection saw messengers arrive one after another, each piece of news more cruel than the last. The oxen, the donkeys, the servants, the fire, the Chaldeans, the wind, the children. Word by word, detail by detail, his life collapsed in layers. And the Bible records this with a haunting sobriety, as if the text itself knew that certain losses need no embellishment to crush the heart. Job tore his robe, shaved his head, and prostrated himself on the ground, not like someone in a theater, but like someone facing something that cannot be negotiated. And yet, in the midst of the collapse, a phrase left his mouth that has echoed through generations. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job 1:21. But that was not the end, because when the first pain seemed unbearable, the second arrived. Job 2 shows the body being attacked, the skin covered in sores, the man sitting in the dust, scraping himself with a broken piece of pottery, surrounded by silence in the presence of a wife who was also broken. Imagine being there, not just losing things, but losing the security of existing, losing the sense that tomorrow will still make sense. This is exactly where the story becomes impossible to ignore, because there are pains that wound possessions, and there are pains that wound identity. Job entered the second. He was not just suffering. He was being stripped to the very limit of what a human heart can endure. And when the soul is already on the ground, the words around it can become sharper than the wound itself. Job's wife, overcome by bitterness, said what many think in their hearts when suffering is prolonged: "Curse God and die," in Job 2:9. But Job did not respond with blind despair. He responded with a kind of wounded reverence, almost impossible. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? Job 2:10. Read that again, not because the phrase is beautiful, but because it reveals the point where pain tries to redefine faith. There are moments when the heart does not understand, yet it still needs to choose whom to trust. and Job chose without receiving an explanation. This was where everything changed. Because the true drama of Job is not just the loss, it is the silence. It is the space between the question and the answer. It is the long night in which the mind tries to find a reason, but finds only an echo. Perhaps that is why so many wounded hearts still recognize themselves in him. Not for the wealth he lost, but for the absence of the answer that remained. In times of anxiety, grief, and loneliness, many still live this same chapter internally. There are those surrounded by people who, nonetheless, feel the weight of Job sitting in the ashes. There are those who smile in public but carry the same ancient question inside. Why? And Scripture does not offer an easy explanation. It offers a presence that has not yet been understood. But the people still did not understand what it meant. Job was being led to a place where human answers are no longer enough, a place where suffering is not resolved with cliches, and faith is not measured by the absence of tears. Here, pain begins to reveal something deeper than loss. It exposes what remains when everything else falls. This is the great tension that continues to pulse throughout this story. Because if God is good, why does He allow the night? If the righteous suffer, what sustains the heart when prayer seems to touch only silence? The answer has not come yet, but it is approaching. It was not the loss of riches that revealed the depth of Job's pain. It was the moment when the pain met the flesh. Because there are sufferings that wound one's history, and there are sufferings that attack the body until the soul recognizes its own limit. Job 2 shows us that the enemy was not satisfied with the desert around him. He wanted the desert inside him. And then came the wounds, not one, not two, but an affliction that took over his skin, his breath, his sleep, and his silence. From the soles of his feet to the top of his head, Job was consumed by a pain that could not be hidden, explained, or softened. Imagine the scene. The man who once managed servants now crawls to a heap of ashes. The man who received honor now finds relief only by scraping his wounds with a piece of pottery. It was not just physical suffering, it was humiliation, it was exposure, it was an entire life reduced to a broken body before a world that no longer had answers. This is where many modern hearts recognize themselves in silence. Because emotional pain, when left uncared for, also corrodes from the inside. It removes firmness, wears down the mind, alters the voice, and shrinks hope. Job was living on the outside what thousands still live on the inside, the feeling of being alive but in ruins. And then his wife appeared, not as a comfort, but as an echo of his own exhaustion. Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. Job 2:9. These words do not come from nowhere. They are born from the collapse of someone who also lost everything. Think about that for a moment. Sometimes, the suffering of a household produces more than just tears. It produces bitter speeches, hasty accusations, and shortcuts to despair. The wounded heart tries to turn mystery into revolt so as not to sink into impotence. But Job did not enter that current. He responded with firmness and pain at the same time. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? Job 2:10. But that was not the end, because the question was no longer just about what Job had lost. Now it was about what he was going to do with his own conscience before a God who seemed distant. This is the point where faith ceases to be theory and becomes survival. The man in the ashes had no comfort. He had no explanation. He had no immediate solution. He had only the name of the Lord and the memory of what the Lord had always been. And many times, that is exactly how the soul is tested. When the pain is too loud, the only possible anchor is not a feeling of peace. It is the conviction that God remains God, even when heaven does not speak. Read that again. Job did not deny the pain. He did not pretend to be strong. He did not say that nothing had happened, but he also did not allow the pain to take the place of final judgment over God. This is deeper than it seems, because in times of grief, anxiety, and long nights, the soul is pressured to conclude that divine silence means divine absence. Job dismantles that lie without shouting. He remains standing, or rather, he remains broken, but not surrendered to blasphemy. And in a generation that measures everything by immediate relief, this faithfulness hurts human pride, because it proves that true faith does not depend on a favorable scenario. And then, something even graver happened. Job's friends arrived, saw his misery, and could not recognize him. They sat beside him, and for 7 days, no one opened their mouth. 7 days of silence, 7 nights of mute presence. This was where everything changed again, because there are pains that even company cannot touch. There are sufferings that leave even friends without language. And that silence, though heavy, was less cruel than the words that would come later. Job's body was in ashes. The hearts of his friends were about to be revealed. The body can fall ill, but it is in the commentary of men that many souls are broken from within. And the people still did not understand what it meant. The illness was not the end of the story. The silence was not abandonment. The ash was not the grave of faith. Everything in Job pointed to something greater, something that had not yet been revealed. Because sometimes God allows the body to bend to show that the soul was not born to live on appearances. And when suffering reaches the point where the skin can no longer endure, the question stops being, "Why me?" and becomes, "What does God want to reveal here?" That question will not be fully answered yet, but it is already burning at the center of the story. 7 days passed like a stone upon the chest. 7 days in which the broken man said nothing, and the men around him also did not know what to say. But silence is never eternal. At some point, pain demands a voice. And when Job finally spoke, it was not to explain his faith. It was to expose the abyss of his soul. Job 3 does not bring a polished prayer. It does not bring a declaration of victory. It brings a lament so deep it seems to tear the very air. Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Job 3:1. Not God, not his friends. The day he came into the world. And think about that for a moment. The man who once blessed the name of the Lord was now wounded at the most sensitive point of existence, the very origin of his life. May the day perish on which I was born, he says, Job 3:3. These are not the words of someone without faith. These are the words of someone whose faith is bleeding. And there is a brutal difference between the two. Job does not abandon God. He only reveals that pain, when it deeply traverses a human being, can make even birth seem like a sentence. What was once a gift now seems a burden. What was once joy now seems a cruel mystery. But that was not the end, because Job's lament is not just despair. It is also the first crack through which the truth will enter. Until now, everything was organized. Prosperity, piety, losses, silence. Now, the man's soul opens into darkness. And it is at this point that the story becomes impossible to ignore. Job begins to ask why light was given to those who find only suffering. Job 3:20. He looks at life and sees a hallway too long for someone who no longer has strength. Look at his language. It is not the language of a man who wants to die on a whim. It is the language of someone tired of carrying a nameless pain. This is where many modern hearts enter the scene. There are those who pray without ceasing and still feel the weight of Job in their chest. There are those who keep working, smiling, and fulfilling obligations, but inside have already said what Job said out loud. Why did I not die at birth? The Bible does not hide this abyss. It faces it. And perhaps that is why Job is so necessary for the broken. Because he teaches that deep pain does not need to be disguised to be brought before God. Sincere lament, when it does not turn into rebellion, can be a form of faith's survival. The friends, however, still did not understand what it meant. To them, suffering required guilt. To Job, suffering was a weight without a map. And between these two visions, the storm of the book was born. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar did not arrive to console a wounded soul. They arrived to organize suffering into theories, and cold theories, when they touch open wounds, can be crueler than the disease itself. What they did not yet know is that grief does not obey human pride. Grief does not bow to simple explanations. Grief demands presence, listening, and awe. This was where everything changed again. Because Job 3 is not just the chapter in which he cries. It is the chapter in which heaven begins to hear what the earth cannot resolve. The man is at the bottom. His voice is broken. Hope seems buried under the ashes. But the very intensity of the lament shows that there is still enough life to protest. And that is decisive. As long as Job speaks, he is not yet dead inside. He is still wrestling with the mystery. He is still trying to name the unnameable. He is still, even without realizing it, holding the bridge between ruin and revelation. But the people still did not understand what it meant. Because Job's speech is not the end of faith, it is the beginning of its purification. When the heart can no longer bear to pretend, it finally reveals what it truly believes, even without knowing. And what Job reveals here is staggering. A righteous soul can enter darkness without ceasing to be righteous. A man can lament without blaspheming. He can wish for the night to hide him without letting go of God's hand. This tension is the place where suffering becomes living theology. Not from a library, from ashes, from tears, from short breath. And then something even graver happened, because the pain that was once only in Job now began to infect the entire environment. The silence of the friends was no longer innocent. Their presence was no longer a cure. The stage was set for the first collision between human grief and religious logic. Job's three friends finally opened their mouths, and in that instant, consolation died. Because not every presence consoles, not every speech heals, and not every man who approaches pain comes with mercy in his heart. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar did not look at Job's wounds with awe. They looked with theory, and when theory touches the raw flesh of grief, it turns into a blade. Job was already broken. Now he would be interpreted, judged, pressured to confess sins he had not committed. Eliphaz spoke first, with the voice of someone who believes they have decoded heaven. Then Bildad hardened the tone even further. Zophar was the cruelest, as if Job's pain were sufficient proof of hidden guilt. But their mistake was not just in their words, it was in their vision. They saw a man suffering and automatically concluded that God was punishing him. Think about that for a moment. This is how the religious heart can become dangerous, when it prefers a simple answer to a wounded soul. It sacrifices people to save its own logic. Job 4, 8, and 11 show this escalation. With every speech, the weight increases. With every accusation, Job's loneliness grows. But that was not the end. Because Job did not remain silent in the face of spiritual injustice. He responded with a pain that no longer fit in his body. "Oh, that my grief were actually weighed," he says in essence. Job 6, 2-3. He wanted someone to understand the magnitude of what he was enduring. Not because he wanted to be acquitted by men, but because his very soul was suffocating under judgments that did not correspond to the truth. There is a particular cruelty in being interpreted by those who do not know your battle. Job lives this, and what keeps him alive is not human comfort. It is his refusal to lie about his condition. This was where everything changed again. Because the debate stopped being just about suffering, it became a battle between appearance and truth. The friends insisted that God always rewards the righteous with prosperity and punishes the guilty with pain. Job, however, knew that reality was deeper. He was not defending his own holiness out of pride. He was defending the complexity of divine action against the arrogant simplification of men. And this is a lesson that spans generations. Not every wound reveals guilt. Not every silence from God means abandonment. Not every tear is a sentence. Job then begins to speak like someone who no longer has the strength for diplomacy. He calls his friends miserable comforters. Job 16:2. The expression is devastating because it reveals a very ancient evil. People who approach pain only to increase its weight. And here exists a wound that many recognize even today. Modern grief is frequently surrounded by rushed phrases, worn-out advice, and spirituality without compassion. Job denounces all of this without needing to write a manifesto. His existence in the ashes is enough. His tired voice is enough. His protest is enough to show us that truth, when born of suffering, has a weight that no rhetoric can sustain, and the people still did not understand what it meant, because Job is not just arguing with friends. He is being pushed to the limit of faith without ready-made answers. There are moments when the believer does not need an explanation, they need God. But the friends delivered analysis. An analysis without mercy is only noise. The entire book begins to transform into a courtroom. Eat and the accused insists that there is a difference between suffering and being guilty. This distinction is crucial for every heart traversing anxiety, depression, or deep grief, because intense pain can convince the mind that everything is lost. Job teaches that not even the most brutal pain has the authority to rewrite the entire truth. But then, something even graver happened. Amidst the accusations, a spark of light emerged in the middle of the darkness. Job, without seeing the end of the road, launched one of the most powerful confessions in all of Scripture. "I know that my Redeemer lives." Job 19:25. It is not yet the final climax, but it is the sign that the soul was not consumed. The voice that once cursed the day now points to someone beyond its own ruin. It is as if, in the heart of the night, Job had found a truth greater than the pain. And that truth does not end the suffering yet, but it prepares the way for God's intervention. And then the silence was broken in a way that no man expected, not by a friend, not by a short answer, but by God himself. Job had endured losses, wounds, accusations, and the crushing pressure of human interpretations. Now, after so much dust raised by pain, the voice that speaks does not come to explain every detail. It comes to reveal who has always been in control. Job 38 opens like thunder over the void. Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Job 38:2. Think about that for a moment. The man who asked why is now confronted with who. But this is not empty humiliation. It is holiness. because there was something Job's friends would never understand. When the human heart tries to reduce God to the size of its own logic, it loses sight of the greatness that sustains everything. The Lord does not respond with an academic defense. He responds with creation, with seas, stars, invisible limits, doors that man does not control, with ice, rain, lions, ravens, and constellations. Every question from God is a spear against pride, and at the same time, an invitation to rest in what cannot be manipulated. And here, the soul begins to tremble in a different way, no longer out of despair, but out of reverence. Job does not interrupt, not because he has won the debate, but because, before the glory, every argument turns to dust. And then the great transformation happens. Job says, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you." Job 42:5. This phrase carries the weight of the entire journey. He did not receive a complete map. He had no answer for every wound. He did not gain a linear explanation for his suffering, but he received something greater, a vision of God. And for a broken soul, that changes everything. Because the ultimate goal of the pain was not just to reveal the reason for the suffering, it was to reveal the majesty of the one who sustains the sufferer. But that was not the end, because before the restoration could come, the truth needed to be spoken out loud. God rebukes Job's friends, and this is startling, because those who spoke in the name of justice are now corrected by the just one himself. They did not speak what was right about God. Job 42:7. In other words, their words were religious, but not true. They had the form of faith, but not the weight of truth. And this exposes an eternal danger. It is possible to speak much about God and yet distort him. It is possible to defend principles without understanding the heart of the Lord. It is possible to advise the wounded, and without realizing it, crush them even deeper. This was where everything changed, because Job's suffering now reached its highest meaning. It was not an example of punishment, nor was it proof of abandonment. It was the stage for a revelation that dismantles human arrogance and preserves the dignity of sincere lament. The man who sat in the ashes now understands that heaven never lost control, even when the earth seemed to collapse. And this truth is tremendous for any heart living through grief, loneliness, or anxiety, because it does not mean the pain does not exist. It means the pain is not sovereign. There is a God greater than the night, greater than the loss, and greater than the silence. And the people still did not understand what it meant. But now the answer begins to take shape with clarity. Job's restoration will come, yes, his days will be renewed, his face will rise again. But the greatest healing will not be material, it will be spiritual. He emerged from the storm with a knowledge that did not fit in his season of prosperity. He emerged with a deeper faith, forged not by comfort, but by presence. And that is what makes this story span centuries without losing its power, because it does not promise the absence of pain. It promises an encounter with God within it. Job had already passed through the fire. He had been wounded in body, crushed in soul, judged by men, and confronted by God himself. Now, after the whirlwind, there remained only one truth impossible to deny. When God speaks, everything that was pride dissolves. Job then responds with a surrender that seems small to human eyes, but is immense before heaven. He recognizes that he spoke of what he did not understand, and he falls silent before the greatness of the Lord. Job 42:1-6. It is not empty defeat. It is the moment when the soul finally stops fighting against the mystery and begins to worship it. But that was not the end, because the same God who exposed the fragility of men also exposed the injustice of the friends. The Lord's anger burned against Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar because they did not speak what was right about him. Job 42:7. Think about that for a moment. Those who accuse Job now need to be confronted by the one in whom they claim to believe. And the divine order is clear: sacrifice, repentance, and prayer. It was not enough to recognize the error in silence. They would need to go through the humiliation of being restored through the very one they had wounded. And the most impressive thing was yet to come. Job, the man in the ashes, would be their intercessor. This was where everything changed, because Job did not just suffer with integrity, he also learned to forgive after the pain. God tells Job to pray for his friends, and when he does, restoration begins to move. Job 42:8-10. There is something deeply sacred in this moment. The man who was crushed by cruel words now lifts his voice to ask for mercy for those same men. This is more than reconciliation. It is spiritual healing. It is as if God were saying that the final prison of suffering is not loss, but bitterness, and Job is freed from it before being freed from everything else. And then something even graver happened. The Lord restored Job's fortunes, not as a weak repair, not as minimal compensation, but as an abundant response. Job 42:10. His brothers, his sisters, and his former acquaintances returned. The table was reopened. The house received people again. Shame was covered, not by the denial of pain, but by the faithfulness of God through it. Job 42:11. Possessions returned. The family grew. His days were extended. And the story ends by saying that Job lived many years after this, seeing children, grandchildren, and the continuity of life that suffering tried to interrupt. Job 42:12-17. But the true weight of this restoration is not just in what he received, it is in who he became. Job did not go back to the beginning. He came out of the furnace different, more humble, deeper, more aware that God's presence is greater than any explanation. He entered the pain knowing God by hearsay. He came out of it seeing him with his own eyes. Job 42:5. And this is the healing that modern grief also needs to hear. Not every answer will come. Not every loss will be understood here. But there is an encounter with God, capable of sustaining the heart even in the darkest place. And the people still did not understand what it meant. But now it becomes clear. The story of Job was never about a man who lost everything and then recovered possessions. It was about a man whose faith was purified until the pain ceased to be the end of the narrative. Grief did not erase the purpose. Silence did not annul the presence. The ash did not defeat the promise. When God closed the story of Job, he showed that no night is long enough to defeat his faithfulness. And now comes the part that many read quickly, but which carries a silent beauty. Job does not end surrounded by ruins, but by people. After the storm, his brothers, sisters, and old friends return to his house. Job 42:11. That man who once seemed alone in the middle of the ashes now sees the table reopened, the bread shared once more, and human presence returning as a sign of mercy. It was not just wealth that God restored. It was bonds. It was dignity. It was the right to live again without the shadow of shame as a prison. But this did not happen by chance. Restoration begins after Job's prayer for his friends. Job 42:10. Think about that for a moment. The heart that was wounded by unjust accusations needed to become an intercessor before receiving back what it had lost. There is a hidden order here. Bitterness closes the soul, but forgiveness expands it. Job prays for those who humiliated him, and heaven moves. This is more than a detail. It is a spiritual key, because healing did not come when he won the debate. It came when he stopped holding on to the wound as an identity. This was where everything changed. His fortune was doubled. The flocks returned. Life expanded. Job 42:12. And yet, the Bible makes a point of showing that sons and daughters also came as part of this new season, with names that carry beauty and honor. Job 42:13-15. This is important because God's restoration is not mechanical. He does not treat people as replaceable objects. He restores life, but he also preserves memory. The new does not erase what was lost. It testifies that God still writes after the pain. And then something even graver happened. Job lived many years after this, saw children, saw grandchildren, saw 4 generations. Job 42:16. The man who had sat in the ashes now observes the continuity of life as a gift that no suffering could permanently erase. It does not mean the loss of his first children ceased to be painful. It means that suffering did not have the final word over the entire story. God did not just interrupt the ruin. He gave back a horizon. He gave back a future. He gave back breath. But the people still did not understand what it meant. Because the beauty of Job's end is not in everything went back to how it was before. That is not it. Job's end is greater. It is the proof that God's faithfulness can traverse the abyss without being corrupted. Job emerges from the furnace knowing the Lord in a deeper way than he knew him before. Job 42:5. And this is the message that remains for every tired heart. There are pains that are not resolved in minutes, but can be traversed without losing one's soul. There are griefs that are not erased, but can be carried under the light of a greater presence. In the end, Job was remembered not just as someone who suffered. He was remembered as someone who remained before God when meaning seemed to have died. And this speaks to those living through anxiety, depression, loneliness, or grief today. Because suffering can change the landscape. But it does not need to destroy faith. The night may be long, but it does not govern eternity. The ash may cover the ground, but it does not erase the voice of the God who still calls you by name. The story of Job does not end with sadness. It ends with reverence. And perhaps that is the hardest and most consoling lesson of all. There is a pain that is only understood after it has passed. And there is a presence that is only recognized when everything around has already fallen. Job taught that lamenting is not the same as abandoning, that crying is not the same as losing faith, that questions are not enemies of devotion when they are born from a heart that still seeks God. If there is something the entire book screams in silence, it is this: suffering does not define a man's value, and pain is not capable of measuring the faithfulness of heaven. Job was wounded, but he was not forgotten. He was tested, but he was not destroyed. He was broken, but he was not abandoned. And in the center of all that smoke, one truth remained standing: God remains God, even when the righteous man does not understand the path. And now the closing must be simple and firm, like a mark on the soul. Perhaps you're in your own chapter of ashes. Perhaps you have already lost the strength to explain what you feel. Perhaps you are tired of hearing advice that does not touch the wound. Then remember Job. Remember that his story did not begin with restoration. It began with faithfulness in the midst of collapse. And that is what makes the end so powerful. Healing may take time, but God's presence does not take time to be real. If this path spoke to you, leave the word Job in the comments and reflect on this with sincerity. Subscribe to walk through other stories that also heal in silence.